I listened to another podcast, and the premise was that the coaches were working with some elite athletes, high performance athletes, uh, and as strength and conditioning coaches, they were trying to convince these, elite athletes that they needed to do more physical preparation outside of their sport because they, reached an elite level without really having to do any of that, any strength and conditioning or any outside type of prep work. They just kind of mastered their sport, got very good at their sport, and got into a high level of competition without having to do any strength and conditioning. And so the strength and conditioning coach in me was like, well, yeah, if we can get them into some strength and conditioning programs, of course they'll probably improve, be a little bit more athletic, maybe a little bit more resilient. But the sports coach part of me was like, well, if they've gotten to this point, they're excelling in their sport, they're among the best in the world at their sport, they haven't suffered injuries that you can kind of uh, see happening. How much strength and conditioning do we need, or do we need to do with these types of athletes? And it reminded me of a conversation I had with an NBA strength and conditioning coach about a particular set of athletes, and so I was talking about working with one player who made it to the NBA level and hardly lifted weights at all. Didn't like to lift weights. Already had a 38, 40-inch vertical jump. Had no serious injuries all the way through high school and college. Was never missed game time. Was always healthy. Always able to play lots of minutes. And so I was talking about, with this type of athlete, why would I risk lifting weights or doing a lot of back squatting or deadlifts or something like that, something that this athlete doesn't want to do, when the potential gains for me are probably minimal. I mean, he's shown to be resilient and he's shown to be a elite athlete. Like, what are we trying to get out of the strength and conditioning that he doesn't want to do? And so the NBA strength and conditioning coach kind of took the other point of view and was like, well, if they already have a 40-inch vertical and I can get them doing squats for a year or two, I can get them, to get a bigger vertical jump. And my counter was, well, is going from a 40-inch vertical jump to a 41-inch vertical jump, is that necessary? Is that the limiting factor in their game? Is that holding them back from reaching their potential? Is the risk, even though I tend to believe weightlifting is fairly safe and it's not going to cause a serious injury, is any potential injury in the weight room or even the fatigue or discomfort that an athlete feels because he doesn't want to lift weights and he's being forced into lifting weights, is that worth the potential gain of maybe 1 inch or 2 inches on top of a already elite level vertical jump? And so, and then you look at, a lot of strength and conditioning coaches complain about soccer players because soccer players traditionally don't like to lift weights. And so the argument is, well, we need to lift weights because we need to prevent injuries, they need to be stronger, et cetera, et cetera. But then you look through almost any sport and injuries continue as more training is done off the court, injuries continue to increase. And so I look back when I played basketball, and at our high school, there was almost no organized off-season training. A lot of players played multiple sports. Most of the best basketball players didn't. They were single sport. And if they did play a second sport as a spring sport after the season ended, um, you know, and there was no real organized conditioning program. We didn't get together and, run on the court. We didn't go onto the track and run. There wasn't any organized conditioning. There was very limited organized weightlifting. It was more like we played open gym and then we were expected to lift weights and we kind of lifted on our own. There was no kind of set program. But as I look back and I was thinking about it, I can't remember a single player who was hurt and missed considerable time. I missed a number of games because of, I got a concussion one year and then I bumped my knee on the court, and hurt my knee, kind of with a contact injury between a defender and the court. And so with the contact injury, it wasn't anything that weightlifting necessarily would have prevented. Um, and so of the other players, kind of in that era, plus or minus 2 years of my high school experience, I don't remember anybody really missing considerable game time because of any kind of injury. There was an ankle injury here or there, but not to any of the star players or the players that played the major minutes, and not anything that cost a lot of game time. And now you look and see, even though we are ahead in sports science and we're monitoring athletes and we're strength and conditioning and off-season programs and year-round basketball and so on and so forth, and the injuries are increasing. So is that a symptom of the year-round play? And athletes were more robust or resilient last generation or in a previous generation because of the multi-sport participation? Is it that the strength and conditioning programs aren't working? Is it the strength and conditioning programs are working too well, and now athletes are getting so strong and so forceful that because of the degree of force that is being put onto the body, that's ending up with injuries? Because athletes are jumping higher than ever and landing with more force because of that, and consequently, is that what's causing more injuries now? I don't know. I think it's all of the above. I definitely think that athletes specializing in an early age and kind of reducing their movement competency probably has something to do with injuries. Obviously, the more force that you're able to generate, you have to stop that force, and over time, that could create injuries. I don't think strength and conditioning itself is causing injuries, but if it's not preventing injuries, if it's not making for more robust or resilient athletes, do we need to force it, and how much do we need to force it? I definitely think that there is some time and some room where athletes need to train in something other than basketball, and especially those that are specializing in basketball. If you're specializing in basketball, I think weightlifting becomes more important because you have to do something to increase your movement competency beyond just what you do on a basketball court. But a lot of what I do with my players isn't in the weight room. It's on the court, and it's teaching basic movements and hopefully strengthening, in these movements. Basic squats, lunges, jumps, hops, bounds, and all the landings that are associated with those as well, changing directions. And so to me, that's the important part of reducing injuries or creating a resilient athlete on the court. And while I do think strength and conditioning has its place, and strength training and sprinting especially, is an important component of athlete development. I wonder with some of these athletes, especially ones that are resistant to it, if we're pushing the strength and conditioning too much. And maybe overdoing it to an extent when we already have athletes who have shown themselves to be elite athletes, elite performers, and resilient athletes. And maybe there are some players or some athletes that don't need as much strength and conditioning because they've gotten to that level, and whatever they've done to get themselves to that level, they have that robust athletic body, and they already are essentially what we're trying to use strength and conditioning to create.